Hi, everyone. So today we're going to start thinking about what we want the foundation of business ethics to look like, namely what kinds of moral principles and obligations we want to have at our disposal to answer some of the bigger questions that we're going to be asking in this class. All right. So last week in the article that you read, and as many of you discussed, we saw that business ethics and the self-interest that motivates exchange are not two things that are incompatible. And we know this, or as Sen explained, we know this because someone can believe that the point of participating in the stock market, for example, so the point of participating in exchange can be to profit, and profit is something, obviously that's self-interested. And nonetheless, we have, or that person rather, has no trouble identifying instances of morally repugnant behavior, right? So if you want to just pause the video for a minute and think about some examples you can think of, things like this that have happened in the stock market. This would be a good moment to do that. So if you didn't pause the video or you couldn't think of an example, the first one clearly is going to be insider trading, right? We could make a lot of arguments as to why it's wrong for the health of the market. If everybody was participating in insider trading, then we would see it would seriously affect have a negative effect on the health of the stock market, right? But even setting that aside, there seems to be a sort of maybe gut feeling about that just being that kind of deception and taking advantage of a system in that way. It feels wrong. So that sense, that gut feeling of just like, that is a bad, that's a bad thing for someone to do. That's going to be the thing that we want to develop, say, certain moral principles or identify certain obligations in order to justify and explain what is going on with that feeling, or explain why that's wrong. Not just sort of saying, well, I just feel that that this is wrong. And as many of you also discussed, there is a lot more to doing business than just participating in the exchange of goods, right? So this was something that was discussed in the article as well. This larger practice of doing business is much more concerned with is also concerned with distribution and production. Arguably, the full amount of doing business. If we sort of broke those things down into categories, there's a lot more happening with distribution and production than just the mere exchange of goods, right? So that's a big portion of what makes up doing business. And not only is being concerned with ethics within business compatible with the goals and purposes of exchange, but it's necessary in order for us to build mutual trust, between consumers and manufacturers and distributors. It's also necessary for protecting the well-being and safety of workers, right? And maybe most importantly, it's crucial for protecting the public goods, spaces, and communities on which, industry depends, right? If you don't have a place to manufacture the goods, then you're going to have a lot of trouble. You're going to have a lot of trouble selling them. For example, if there's there's just blatant disregard for the environmental impact of certain industries, and they make certain areas inhabitable or underwater, right? It's going to be very difficult for other industries to put down roots and start manufacturing in those areas. So we want to protect the public space in order to not just manufacture goods, right? But also we want, the consumers to be available to purchase them. If there is some kind of widespread destruction that happens as a result of, again, say, an environmentally unsustainable industry practice, then all of the consumer base in that area not only isn't going to be purchasing any goods, right, but that could impact the availability of workers in that area. So these are the kinds of things that are really crucial in order for us to do business in this much larger sense. So consequently, the moral principles and obligations that derive from the study of business ethics are not only compatible, again, with the self-interested nature of exchange, but manufacturers and distributors depend on us employing these principles, thinking about these things in order for everyone to keep doing business. So, with the importance of business ethics in mind, today we're going to start thinking about what these kinds of principles and obligations look like, what we might want them to look like. Okay. All right. So we have some images here, right? And for those of you that are familiar, maybe some of you are familiar with all of these things, you can look at that right away and you go, oh yeah, that's a example of something that's really morally problematic. Maybe some of you are only familiar with one or two of these images, but intuitively, I would hope that there's at least one image on this screen that everybody sees and they go, yeah, that's really messed up, right? Maybe in particular, even this one right here, right? So again, if you want to pause the video and take a moment to just think through possible morally problematic issues that arise within each of these images, do so. And now that you're back, or if you didn't feel like pausing the video and thinking it through, let's talk through some of these things. All right. So first and foremost, we have this issue with GameStop. For those of you who are familiar, there was a boom in people buying up a bunch of GameStop stock, and I believe it was the majority of people trading in this stock, buying up this stock, were doing so through Robinhood, which was supposed to be something that is it's a stock buying and selling app that like regular people could use. So you didn't need a lot of money to essentially participate in the stock market. And what this did is it caused a huge spike. I won't get into the nitty gritty details of it. For those of you who are interested, who are unfamiliar with it, you can just Google GameStop and Robinhood. But the long and short of it is Robinhood essentially adjusted the terms of their services without speaking to all of these people who had been using this app and buying up this stock. And as a result, a lot of people were limited in ways that they shouldn't have been. But ultimately what it comes down to is Robinhood said it was providing one kind of service, and then it changed the terms of that service in such a way that it was no longer the thing that, customers people who were buying the app, using the app, were depending on and assuming was true of the app when they first got it. So then in the next image, and I would think that almost everyone in this class has probably had an experience like this. You see something on the internet, it looks right, you get it. Technically, it's the thing that it was supposed to be, but anyone with half a brain could sort of look at what that image was that was being sold to you, the thing that you bought, and would agree that, wow, this thing that I ended up with, that's not what I assumed. Anyone with half a brain could see that, somebody who's clicking on this to buy this, say, dinosaur animal pillowcase, I can't remember how it was listed on Amazon, right? You would think that it is a pillowcase that is in the shape of a dinosaur, right? you would not think that it is an image of a little kid sleeping on a pillow that is in the shape of a dinosaur. You would think that you were buying that actual dinosaur pillow. And so there's another instance where customers thought that they were buying one thing. They were well within reason to assume that they were getting that thing. The image, the way that the product was being sold, gave the impression that that was what was being sold. But nonetheless, what people ended up with was not the thing that they wanted. All right. The next one, Facebook and fake news. I think a lot of you are familiar with what's going on here. So, there's been, and the issues that arise from this are broad. We could probably spend, I could spend an entire 2-hour lecture talking about all the issues that come up with Facebook. But the main thing that I think is going to be relevant for us thinking about, when we're starting out looking at this idea of like, okay, so these general principles that we can use to, support the market, support the production and distribution of goods, right? The first thing that we want to think about with Facebook is, what kinds of responsibilities does a business like Facebook have, a platform that reaches so many people? What kinds of responsibilities do they have to protect public good, right? So this is a term that I think many of you are familiar with, corporate social responsibility. What kinds of social responsibilities does Facebook have, right? It's a social media network. So we would think that there should be some concern with public safety. And yet we find that because of algorithms that are designed for essentially designed to keep people be on Facebook, keep scrolling for as long as possible, those hot fake stories are really big hits. Those big fake news, clickbait kind of headlines and things like this, that stuff in people's feed keeps people scrolling. So whether or not Facebook wanted to cause this huge misinformation crisis when it comes to things like government elections and COVID-19, like information about the pandemic going on, because Facebook has these algorithms in place to keep scrolling, we have widespread misinformation about things that are really important. And that information, that spreading that misinformation and people thinking that kind of, different things about, say, the pandemic or the last presidential election, are true that aren't, it's resulted in, a lot of harm. And I think that, most recently, there's been a lot of misinformation spread about a antiviral for horses. It's for veterinary purposes only. And there's been a lot of misinformation on Facebook and elsewhere about using this medication to treat COVID. And as a result, people are taking far too much of this thing that was actually intended for horses, and they're getting really sick. So we want to ask, to what extent is Facebook responsible for disseminating any misinformation that concerns this drug, which is called Ivermectin, I believe. Right? Do we hold them responsible for it? How obligated are they to make sure that there's not one single story floating around about this medication that doesn't actually treat COVID? It actually makes people sick. Okay, the final image that is reflecting an issue that is often referred to as planned obsolescence. So I would think that many of you, if you're not familiar with the term, you're familiar with the idea. So if you want to take a quick look there, not just for iPhones, but for really like any device, just this changing in the kinds of ports that it uses to charge, whether or not you could hook in earbuds, that sort of thing. And, these things that we really, really, for phones, right? features of our phones that are like really central to why we have the phone in the first place, or are crucial to the phone continuing to function. By changing how accessible those things are in newer models, it forces people to buy newer models. So, a big example would be the image that's in the middle there on iPhones. In the newer models, Apple has now gotten rid of the auxiliary jack. So before, you used to be able to plug in your earbuds, and now you have to have wireless ones, or you need to get a dongle to convert the charging port into something that you can plug earbuds into. Now, Apple has a big, lots of reasons why this actually is like all about making the better product, right? But we see this kind of thing happening again and again with Apple, which really forces people to, in order for them to keep using these objects that we depend on very much, like our computers and our phones, we need to get the newer models, right? This is also something that that although there isn't great legislation that like fights this in the United States, but in the UK, they have tried to put laws in place that prevent companies from writing updates for the technological advices that they make, writing updates that are intended to slow down or undermine the performance of those devices. So in the UK, I think it was either last year or the year before, Apple was actually found guilty. They had proof that Apple was writing updates specifically to make older phones not run as well, right? So like we need those updates in order to, let's say, run apps that we use regularly, like a Gmail app or an Outlook app, something like this. After a certain point, you might have had this experience where like you click on an app on your phone. This isn't just true of Apple. I'm sure it's true of other devices. But you click on that app and it's like, oh, well, you can only run this really old version of this app because this is the operating system version that you have currently. It's out of date. So then you're like, okay. So then you go and you update your phone, and then all of a sudden, your phone's not running as well anymore. Well, what they proved in the UK was that Apple did that on purpose. Why? To make your current phone obsolete in order to force you into buying a new one. And that kind of behavior, I think, understandably builds a lot of mistrust between consumers and Apple, which, given Apple's like grip on the market, maybe it's not going to hurt them too much. But if we saw this happening regularly across the board with a lot of different things, I think that it would probably really impact things like the exchange of goods, right? The stock market, a lack of trust or faith that this iPhone maybe that we're spending either like $200 a month on, or somebody can like buys outright for whatever it is now, $1,800, right? They're going to be a lot less inclined to do that if like they feel really, really certain that that phone is going to be obsolete in a year, right? And if that happens, if there's like serious mistrust that's built up, then yeah, that's going to affect what the stock market looks like for Apple, right? That might end up affecting like various aspects of distribution and production. Those are all things that aren't good. And business ethics, to bring it back around, can help us examine that stuff, identify when things are wrong, identify certain principles and obligations that businesses have in order to prevent issues like that from arising in the future. Maybe it's a lost cause for Apple, but I think that there are things that happen maybe on a smaller scale where that's definitely irrelevant too. All right, so what we are going to do today is start to develop, like I said, different principles to explain why things like what Amazon, Robinhood, Facebook, we'll just say Apple, have done wrong. So, and And in order to explain why they've done things wrong, we're going to need some basic moral principles or identify some obligations that businesses have. So then once we do that, we can say something like, hey, it's wrong to deceive customers, Amazon, because, you know, X moral principle says so. So that's a good thing to keep in mind, that when I say explain, right? So if I, you know, say in a question on a worksheet or something like this, I say, okay, well, I want you to explain why, right? A really good thing to do is to be able to say, well, say, for example, like in an explanation of why you think something's wrong, you can say, well, this moral principle tells us that that thing is wrong. That would constitute a good explanation. All right, so these are our first steps in identifying some principles and obligations. All right, so in the videos that you watched, we talked about, in the videos that you watched, they talked about this thing, this scenario called the trolley, or the trolley example. And in our search for certain moral principles, and we're going to be asking these kinds of general questions about the kinds of things that people owe one another, and then we'll use that to explain some of the moral obligations that businesses might have. The trolley example is going to help us. Some of the answers and some of the discussions that surround the trolley example is going to help us take this first step in answering this question: what kinds of obligations, or what do businesses owe us? All right, so philosophers like Philippa Foot and Judith Jarvis Thompson have argued that we have a gut sense about these things, right? So taking a step back from the business ethics side of things and just thinking more on an individual level, they're thinking, okay, so what kinds of, you know, moral principles and obligations do we have? Where do we start answering that question? Let's turn to our gut. Let's think through some scenarios, and based off of our reaction to those scenarios, we'll be able to identify certain principles and or moral obligations that we have more generally in these not so weird moral dilemma senios. Okay, so we have two different scenarios. The first actually I should clarify. So the first view that we're going to be looking at, the first sort of like stab at answering this question, is going to be the view that that Philippa Foot had, that there's this really important distinction between doing and allowing. All right, so before I explain what that distinction is, we're first going to look at the scenarios that she looked at. So she imagines two different cases. The first is one where you have a doctor with 5 very, very sick patients. And there's this traveler, no one knows, not connected to anyone, doesn't have any family or anything like this, and who is healthy, walks in the door. And that traveler, if that doctor kills that traveler in a way that preserves this person's organs, the doctor can turn around and use all of those organs to save these 5 patients. All right, so think about, do you think that it is morally permissible or okay for the doctor to kill that one healthy person in order to save the 5? Now, compare this to the trolley example. So we have a conductor who is driving a train, and ahead, the conductor sees there are 5 people tied to the railroad. They look down and they see another path that they can send the trolley. They can steer the trolley down another path. And in doing so, avoid hitting the 5 people. But oh no, they see that another one person is tied to the separate set of railroad tracks. Now, think. Do you think it's okay for the conductor to turn the trolley? Well, I think so. On this slide, you can see what Philippa Foot's answer was. So in the first one, she said that it's not okay to kill the traveler, right? But it is okay to turn the trolley. Why? Because it looks like the math in both cases is right? One person dies versus 5 people die. And she says that the thing that makes these two different cases, or makes these scenarios different, is that in the first case, the doctor is intending to do something to cause harm. In the second case, the conductor is simply allowing harm to happen, because the train is going to keep going no matter what. Someone is going to get hit no matter what. It's a matter of, okay, here you want as many people, you want as little, someone's going to get hurt no matter what. So we want to have as much hurt or as little hurt done as possible. All right. So there's a difference between doing harm, intending to cause harm, and allowing harm to happen. So that seems to make sense on an intuitive level as well, especially if, we step aside these really weird, very, very morbid, violent cases. Like, these things, obviously, these are not the kind of moral dilemmas that we run into on a day-to-day basis. If we dial it back a little bit and we think about, different things that happen in our life. I think that we pretty regularly hear people say that there's a difference between, explicitly intending to do something, right? And like standing back and just being like, I don't know, like allowing it to happen, and in a case where you got no other option, you have to let it happen, but you can interject and you can do something to make a little less harm happen, then that's the right thing to do, right? It's making the best of a bad situation, right? If somebody's going to get hurt no matter what, jumping in and trying to make sure that as little hurt happens as possible. Okay, so it seems pretty intuitive. Well, Judith Jarvis Thompson tweaks the trolley example just a little bit and shows us that we maybe shouldn't be thinking that that distinction means very much, or at the very least that those two cases, the doctor versus trolley, is shedding light on any sort of deep, serious gut feeling about morality, or be able to derive any of those moral principles from it. And she does this by simply changing who is the one responsible for making the decision. So in Philippa Foot's example, the original scenario, the person who is facing this moral dilemma is the conductor of a train. And Thompson changes this to a bystander standing at a switch. So instead of being this person who's responsible, in this position where like hurt's going to happen, harm's going to happen no matter what, I just need to make the best of a bad situation, there's a person that is standing by a switch. And you can see that circled here. And that person is watching a trolley come down a train, and they see, okay, if the trolley keeps going, it's going to hit the 5 people. If I flip this switch and redirect it, it'll only hit the 1 person. And what makes this a very interesting case for Foot's view, or what makes this a problematic case for Foot's view, is we still give the same answer. We say that the thing, or most people will say that the thing you ought to do, what you are morally obligated to do, is flip the switch, turn the trolley to hit the one person instead of allowing it to go and hit the five, right? So that's the key difference, is the bystander is going to flip a switch that's doing something, right, to make the trolley go and hit the one person versus hitting the five. All right, so if we turn back to the first two cases that were supposed to, shed light on this really important distinction according to Foote, we see that bystander, so the person at the switch, all of a sudden looks a lot like doctor. Now, what was the answer that we had to the doctor moral dilemma? What did we say the doctor should not do in that scenario, in Foote's scenario? We said that it's not permissible for the doctor to kill the innocent traveler in order to save the 5 sick people, right? He's not, because why? They're not, he or she or they are not, okay, it's not morally permissible for them to do something, to intend to inflict harm in order to simply save people, right? That was supposed to be this really key distinction. Now, all of a sudden, we still feel that's the right thing to do, or a lot of people still feel that it's the right thing to do something if you're the bystander, right? Instead of allowing the trolley to just keep barreling on down the road and kill the 5 people, we think there's this moral obligation to still do something and turn the trolley, right? So that would make it feel, so at this point now, it's like, it's like, well, what are these, are all of these weird scenarios telling us anything? Is there still a distinction to be made between them? And according to Judith Jarvis Thompson, there most definitely is. So what is the thing that distinguishes them? What is the thing maybe that Philippa Foote missed? Thompson argues that, this doing and allowing thing, that's not telling us very much, but there still is a really important difference between, say, doctor and these other cases. And that difference concerns something that she calls the doctrine, or something that was referred to her, which was an idea that was put forth, prior to when she was writing and things like this. But this idea of the doctrine of double effect. So the doctrine of double effect states that it is that there are things that are foreseeable consequences of one's actions that don't necessarily result directly from those actions, but they're sort of byproducts of that action. So initially, one way that one might want to try to apply that thinking, the doctrine of double effect, to answer the doctor case is say, the immediate intended consequence of that doctor's action is to kill, and killing's not right. Versus Trolly, where the trolley was like we were talking about before, or like I was talking about before, it was going down, it was going to kill somebody no matter what. Turning the trolley, it's really unfortunate, but turning the trolley saved these 5 people. And unfortunately, there was another person that was on the track. And what Thompson does point out, and she significantly strengthens this view, she points out, she says, hey, the person in the traveler and the doctor, right, the innocent person that was going to get their organs harvested, that person had to die in order for the doctor to save the 5. And in Trolly, it would have been much better if there was no one on that other track, but unfortunately there was, right? So in order to save the 5 in Trolly, no one needed to die. It just was it was an unfortunate it was just an unfortunate side effect of doing the right thing. Versus in Doctor, the traveler needed to die in order for the doctor to save the 5. And what Thompson argues is that this sheds light on sort of principle, a moral principle that I think probably resonates with a lot of people, which is it's never right to use someone as a means to an end. So one way to sort of identify, like, make this distinction, like, what's the difference, say, between like these like byproduct side effect type things and like the immediate intended consequence, right? Well, one way that you can evaluate that in a like a moral dilemma scenario is by asking, like, am I using someone as a means to achieve an end? Or was this a situation where they were sort of at the wrong place at the wrong time, right? So this view seems like it would be especially useful when we start to think back on some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, issues that would arise within business ethics, for example, deceptive advertising, right? You know, you need, say, so Amazon or the seller on Amazon or whatever needed to deceive people. They say use their trust as a means to achieve these ends, right? To achieve the ends that they wanted, which was sell their product. So they're like, oh, okay, that seems like what? So then if we want to try to use this to answer this big question, this box in green, what do businesses owe us? Well, they owe us not using us as a means to achieve an end, and in a negative way, not use our suffering, say, or something that explicitly is harmful for us as a means to an end. Obviously, because of the nature of the relationship between, say, buyers and sellers, people are using people as means to ends, as long as, and this is where we could really clearly see the principle, as long as it's not using something that is clearly harmful. Whether that's deception or, physical safety, something like this, as long as it's not harmful for the well-being of a person, then that kind of relationship is okay. So it can sort of limit, it can work as a way to evaluate, like, to what extent is advertising in this way morally permissible? All right. So that seems, I think that when I've thought through these things over and over, every time I look at that, I'm like, that really does that. There's something that rings very true about that. That is something that I do on a gut level, say. I really feel like, yeah, that is something that's especially bad when businesses sort of exploit the vulnerabilities of consumers, for example. It seems like a good principle to have. Don't use our suffering as a means to your end, Amazon, for example. So it sounds good. Sounds good on an intuitive level. It seems like a pretty generally applicable principle. Now, since this is a philosophy class, the next thing we'd want to do is say, okay, how might someone disagree with this? So in the reading for this week that you did, so everything that I just discussed was, they were points that were touched on in the videos that you watched. But in the reading that you did this week by Peter Unger, he argues that Foote and Thompson, he doesn't point to them explicitly. He does indirectly, which I won't get into, but he doesn't point to them explicitly, but it's just this practice that they have of assuming, starting out on this foot of saying, okay, let's examine what our reactions are to these wild moral dilemma scenarios. And then let's pull out the moral principles and obligations from there. He says that is the wrong place to start. And he argues that the reason why is that our minds trick us into ignoring the stuff that actually really matters. And if we sort of take a step back, we can see really matters about these cases. And once we take a step back and we look at what really matters in these cases, what we see is that suffering is bad and we should do everything within our power to prevent it. Okay, so how does he get us to take this step back? Well, he puts forward four different, he creates a very complicated scenario. And for those of you that were trying to read through this part and you were just going, what is he actually talking about? I made this diagram. So he presents this very complicated scenario with some very complicated different ways to or options for action. And then uses that to show us where he's right and where Thompson and Foote are wrong. Okay, so these are the four options available. So we have this situation where we're operating from this perspective where each of these one of these options are things that we would be capable of doing. So, physically we wouldn't be able to be in all of the places that he's assuming that we'd be in, but we'll just set that aside. So you have a trolley that is barreling down a track towards 6 people tied to the rails. All right, and we have some stuff that's going on around that trolley. If you do nothing, the trolley is just going to continue, and then the 6 people will die. But also in this scenario is an option for you to flip this little switch over here, switch A. And if you flip switch A, you'll turn the trolley down this other track that will hit 3 people. So in that situation, if you go with option 2, 3 people will die and 6 people will live. All right, now you have this third option. There are 2 people in a trolley that you see that's coming down this other road. And so there's 2 people in this trolley that's about to go over this bridge and continue on its way. There are 2 people in this trolley. Now you can flip switch B. You can change the direction of this trolley with two innocent people on it, to turn down the track. And in doing so, you know that it will collide with the trolley that's gunning for these people, these 6 people on the end of that track. So you could flip switch B and 2 people would die. The 2 people that would collide with the runaway trolley here, right? Because it would cause this huge explosion, they would die. So option 3, you could flip switch B and 2 people would die and 6 people would live. Okay. Finally, the fourth option, there's a person who is roller skating down the road. If you push that person into this trolley, that is this runaway trolley that's gunning for these 6 people down here, it will stop this trolley and one person will die and 6 people will live. One of the things that happens with these examples often is that people try to say, they argue against the physics of it, the possibility of being able to say, do all these different things and stuff like that. Well, it's really important to just resist trying to be like, well, if if this one person would stop it, like, couldn't you go grab something else, then you could stop the trolley, then nobody would die and those 6 people would live. That's not the point of looking at these things. The point of looking at these things is to if we just assume that those are the only options available, right? We're supposed to be looking at how we react to them, or looking at our reasons for why we think one thing is a better thing to do than the other thing, to help us understand what sort of moral principles are underlying our reactions to these cases. So don't worry about the physics. Don't worry about, well, if I could have pushed this person on the skates, it would have stopped the trolley. Why couldn't I have grabbed this bag of rocks that's over there and done the same thing? For whatever the reason, it's not the option. What we need to be looking at and thinking about are these 4 different options. So however you want to cash it out, however complicated or weird, you have one option where 6 people die. You have another option where 3 people die, 6 people live. You have another option where 2 people die, 6 people live. And finally, you have a 4th option where 1 person dies and 6 people live. So which do you think is the best option? I think it's pretty clear. 1 person dies, 6 people live, right? And that's the point that Peter Unger wants to make. He says, if we really start to look at the thing that is the most bothersome, okay, it doesn't have anything to do with, or if we look at the options that we find to be not great versus great, better than worse, all of these sorts of things, how we're evaluating this. It doesn't have so much to do with this doing or allowing thing. It doesn't have so much to do with this doctrine of double effect thing or using people as a means to an end thing. What matters at the end of the day is that suffering is bad, and we need to do everything within our power to make sure that people suffer as little as possible, right? It's always the less suffering choice. The choice where we can make sure there is less suffering, that is the right thing to do. And what he argues is we come up with all of these different ways to ignore the importance of doing that, to ignore the importance of trying to minimize as much suffering as we can in the world. And one of the things that he spends a lot of time talking about is this idea that, people coming up with reasons, not to donate essentially as much as they possibly could to various organizations like UNICEF, organizations that provide aid and relief to other places in the world, other places within, he doesn't talk about it, but other places within this country where people are in desperate need of that kind of help, that sort of thing, why we're not doing everything, within our power financially to help those organizations and those individuals, right? And what's interesting is he was writing prior to things like GoFundMe and stuff like this, right? Prior to Twitter and people being able to, send out their Venmo handle and get money, say, paying their rent that month. So now I think that it's even those kinds of practices, but those technologies, or how technology has made those kinds of exchanges possible, it's even more than when Peter Unger was writing, right? Like, we're really, I'm sure that a lot of you if you're on social media, like, you have feeds that are full of people asking for money, asking for help with things, right? And when it comes to somebody saying, hey, can you Venmo me $15 so I can buy groceries and feed my kid, right? It makes it a lot harder to say, spend $15 on something that you don't need, right? That you don't say that's like that isn't food that you need to eat that day. Any sort of like luxury or extravagance, like new pair of shoes, like cute app, video games, like a nice hair product, like various things like this, all these little luxuries. You know, what Peter Unger is trying to push back on is the idea that, you know, we think that our brain comes up with all these reasons. We want to think about all of these things, like these distinctions between doing and allowing, and, you know, not using people as a means to an end, to like explain what, you know, what we think the right thing is to do in these different scenarios, when at the end of the day, what we don't want to admit is like really what matters is the fact that we should be trying to limit suffering as best we can. And we don't want to admit that, because then that would mean having to give up all of the little luxuries that we have in our life, like all of the little like 50-cent, $5, you know, I don't know, like different, you know, different people have different, like different things that they do and different amounts that they spend, but like any little luxury, whether it's like 50 cents, $5, $20, $100, $1,000, $10,000, and, you know, and onward, any little too large amount that we spend on those luxuries, we don't want to admit that, you know, that is money that would be better spent, you know, sending or better spent by an organization that, or an individual, where we are limiting the amount of suffering that people experience in this world. And for what it's worth, for those of you that read that bit of his, and even setting aside how we apply it within business ethics, I think that there have been a lot of really great arguments made against how extreme Unger's view is. There's a lot of stuff that he's missing, right? He is writing from a very specific perspective. He's a wealthy white man, like almost in an ivory tower. Down at NYU. His office is way high above the ground. He has like this beautiful, he's telling people to do all these things sitting in an office that's like overlooking the Manhattan skyline with like his purebred dog that I have a very strong feeling was a very expensive dog. Right. So, which isn't to necessarily say he's wrong or flawed in any way, but I think that we can all sort of like think about how it's a lot different for a person who's literally sitting in that position to be telling everyone like, you need to cut back on all those luxuries and give everything away because that's the way that you can ensure that there's no suffering in the world. And someone who doesn't live in a situation like that, right? Like somebody who's living hand to mouth, trying to get through this pandemic, and like, yeah, maybe that hair product, that nail polish, that video game, whatever is the thing that made you feel a little bit better. And it seems like there is an inherent value to those kinds of luxuries, and maybe that inherent value is something that Peter Unger is missing. So that was just my little side note. So setting that aside and just sort of like looking at what he's arguing at face value, this idea that suffering is bad and we should do everything within our power to prevent it. If he is right, then just thinking this through, just kind of like floating it out there, because this seems like a pretty strong objection, right, to Judith Jarvis Thompson. What kinds of obligations, moral obligations, would businesses have? And, in the same way that I think there are some pretty extreme consequences that I highlighted talking about this on an individual level, if we try to apply this principle and these obligations to businesses, if we pin that on businesses and how we think businesses ought to operate, we see similarly extreme consequences, right? I'm not going to go into this, but if you feel like there's some immediate, if you're thinking like, okay, so suffering is bad and businesses should do everything within their power to prevent it, what do you think this would do to businesses? And if you have a really strong answer that you're like, oh, this is wild, this is ridiculous. Or if you're like, oh, wow, this really clarifies some of the things that I think businesses should be doing. If you have a strong reaction to that, that would be a great thing to write about in this week's blog post or in this week's discussion board thread. And if something that you have a lot of thoughts about, not something that you really want to engage with on the discussion board, you are also welcome to just email me your answer, and I'd be more than happy to give you some extra credit for that. And for those of you who have thought about the implication of Unger's argument and you go, oh, this is not good. I don't think there's some of like, yeah, I get this piece about how suffering is bad and we really should be doing a lot to try to like limit it and like try to keep suffering down to the absolute minimum. But I don't like this extreme way that he's going. The reading for next week, or the next reading in this module, Kindness to Strangers by Kwame Anthony Appiah, might be of service to you. So on that note, I'm going to be ending this first lecture in our current module, and I will be posting the second lecture, which will be on Appiah's Kindness to Strangers next week. All right, thanks everyone, and I hope you have a good rest of your week.